So hi everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started in about 2 minutes.
Maybe I should have changed my background too. I want to be in the mountains.
Yeah, I was doing this talk and they requested that we had a soothing nature backdrop. And I just love the soothing nature backdrop so much I didn't change it back afterwards. So it was really good.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone, my name is Elisa and I will be hosting today's lecture. Today's ESW Talks is given by Kris Donaldson. Kris is a housing navigator at Search Homeless Services in Houston. They received their Master's of Science in Community and Regional Planning from the University of Texas in 2018 and completed their Climate Reality Project training in 2020. They enjoy gardening, buying from local artists, and riding their bike. Kris's lecture will be about the intersection of homelessness and climate change. The speaker will investigate how climate change impacts the most vulnerable in society, including the most vulnerable in our own cities. They will paint a picture of how climate change causes and fans the flames of homelessness in different ways depending on the climate of the state. The speaker will with how we might go about remedying some of these issues. Kris, take it away.
Great. Hi, everybody. Let's jump right in. All right, I'm assuming y'all can see my screen.
Yes.
Maybe. Great. Okay. Then, yeah, I'll get started. I guess I don't really have to introduce myself or this anymore. But yeah, we're talking about the intersection of homelessness and climate change, environmental protection. Y'all know the synonyms. And I guess now y'all know me too. Very passionate about affordable housing, about sustainability. And right now I do work in homeless services in Houston, Texas. I've been in Texas for most of my life, so I will be talking about Texas as one of my case studies, but also another. I'd like to start with a question. We're a little limited on time, so this isn't actually interactive, but get thinking, who do we protect the environment for? Now, there's a couple answers that I expect to get. One is kind of cliche. People who care about the environment are rich white liberals. We all know that one's not true. But a more common answer that's earnest is our children. Lots of people think about the future, and maybe not our children, but just the generations ahead of us. And I think also people want to protect the environment for everyone. Absolutely everyone is impacted by the environment, is affected by climate change. But there's another answer that I actually hear quite a bit, and that's the one that I want to focus on today, and it's protecting the environment for the most vulnerable. Now, when we talk about protecting the environment for the most vulnerable, I feel like the most common narrative I hear is the most vulnerable at this global perspective. So you can see on the map that the countries who are most likely to be really see catastrophe from global climate change tend to be the poorest countries, other than the Middle East, where you see extreme heat. But countries, say America, for example, are more likely to have higher financial costs due to climate change, but you're not seeing people being uprooted the way they are in Guatemala. This picture is people in Guatemala that are likely going to become climate refugees. And become part of our vulnerable population eventually. But you also see people in Bangladesh and Haiti and Honduras. These countries are especially vulnerable because they are impacted by climate change over and over and over again. Other countries will temporarily come onto this list, countries like Thailand and Myanmar, because they get hit by one really bad storm that was impacted by climate change. But some countries, particularly the poor ones, are hit over and over and over again by rising sea levels, just more consistent rain, things like that. And I feel like this narrative, which we are all starting to get more familiar with, can also be applied right at home. It's the most vulnerable right at home that are also most negatively impacted by climate change, as we would expect. The way that our society has started to recognize this is through environmental racism in particular and climate justice, where racism and ecological destruction sort of overlap. And in these ways, the most obvious are typically pollution. We know that poor communities and communities of color tend to have worse rates of pollution. Their air quality is worse. Not only their natural water quality, but also their potable water tends to be worse. And then a big one that's close to my heart is nuisance land use. Things that are a nuisance and negatively impact the health of a population are more likely to be placed in communities of color and poorer communities. And that's true both within cities and outside of cities. So terminals in industry, you might see closer to an urban neighborhood, where pig farms, if you go out into more rural areas, are way more likely to be next to communities of color, particularly Black communities, and have those negative health effects, smells, particulate matter in the air, increased rates of cancer even next to these land uses. This is one of the ways that our ecological protection has fallen short, particularly for communities of color. One way that you can see it, probably close to your own neighborhood, I'm assuming anywhere you can go and you can look at it with your own eyes, is inequitable parkland. Some cities have fewer parks in poorer communities, fewer parks in communities of color, but almost all of them have lower quality parks. So we're talking about not taking care of the landscape as much, the landscaping. We're talking about not having the same infrastructure within the park, not having trails, not having up-to-date or perhaps safe playgrounds. Things like that are one of the ways that our built environment has increased the disequity between the poor and the privileged. And this is what is starting to link us into this sort of comparison between homelessness and climate change, particularly for the people who are literally unhoused, so literally homeless, not just in poverty. Heat is huge. The climate effect on heat is extremely detrimental to the homeless population's health. This image is from the heat wave in October of 2019, so just about a year ago. I mean, I'm in Texas, so I'm looking at that like 93 in October, and you see hundreds all across the South. You can also see, I want to point out, Arizona is one of the big ones where the heat is literally killing their homeless population. Lots of places will create cooling centers. I know we have them here in Houston in the summer to get people off the streets for a couple of hours when it's particularly hot, but the cost associated with that is high. And on top of that, the heat is still detrimental to people's health, even if we are able to implement these cooling centers. And while global climate change isn't always associated with heat, you do see more extremes. So these extremes are becoming more common and more dangerous, particularly in the American South. This is made worse with the urban heat island effect. The urban heat island effect is a death sentence to our homeless populations. It is created by removing some of the things that regulate temperature and adding things that increase the heat. So let's start with the ones that are on the slide. Heat absorption is perhaps the biggest player in this. Our buildings, our asphalt, all the concrete and all of our sturdy materials retain heat. This has twice the effect that you may expect. The first thing it does is just increase the heat as it is, but it also stores the heat more than a rural environment or an ecological area. When it stores the heat, it means that it continues to release it through the night. If you're talking about heat exhaustion, heat stroke, essentially overheating in a dangerous way, this is unlikely to happen just because you go to a hot place. It's likely to happen when your body doesn't get any time to be able to regulate its temperature down. So this the heat staying within the city at night is as dangerous as it getting to 100 degrees in the day, because the people can't go in and can't cool down. So the unsheltered population is way more at risk. Even at night, when we know the temperatures drop a little, they drop less in the city. The other ways that the heat island affects is plants will help, will use the heat energy. The plant transpiration and the water evaporation helps to cool, again, the rural and natural environments, but we don't have the same amount of flora within our cities to help enact that process. Water penetration, very similar, the way it transfers the heat. So the heat island effect, luckily, is one of those things that we can also address locally. Within your own city, if it's an issue, you can enact changes within your own city, but we'll get to those later. Another influence on the health of the homeless population in general across many cities, I would venture to say every major city and even less major cities, is pollution. Pollution is so dangerous to our homeless population, and we know the kind of environmental degradation we're doing when we do it, and it is perhaps the easiest one to see when we're talking about direct health effects to our homeless population. I have some stats here from the US Department of Health and Human Services report. This is super recent. In fact, it was made when they were addressing coronavirus, which is a whole other can of worms. We don't have to open it. It showed that 24% of homeless patients had asthma. You can see the comparison of the general population under here. So 17% of general population, 5% of the homeless patients had chronic bronchitis, just 3% of general population, 23% had chronic obstructive lung disease, just 11% of the general population. So you can see that when it comes to lung health in particular, the homeless population is twice as likely to have these kinds of diseases and illnesses. This has so many elements going into it. For one, if you're out in the pollution, perhaps you're more likely to develop these issues. Second, if you're homeless, you don't have the same kinds of access to health care that would allow you to treat it. But the last one that I really want to dig into right now is that if you already have these issues and you're out on the street and people are continuing to pollute and produce emissions, likely right next to where you sleep at a highway underpass or on a sidewalk, it's damaging to your already damaged lungs, to your already damaged body. And there's not a lot you can do to get away from it. So when we pollute our planet, we're also directly impacting the health of our homeless population, specifically their lung health. But also you can see that goes into their cardiovascular health as well and mental health. So I said I wanted to look at a couple case studies and how the way climate impacts homelessness is different on different states. And with what we've seen this year, I knew that we had to look at California. For those of you in California, I'm sure you're very familiar with this. For those of you who are literally anywhere else, you're probably wildfires have been just such a good way to start talking about climate change if we want to look at optimistically. As far as the way wildfires are related to climate change, an obvious one is drought. This is the drought map for the US that I could find that was most recent. It's just November this year, so 5 days ago. That dark red, that is extreme exceptional drought. And then even down to just the yellow, that's abnormally dry. And we can see on this map that there's actually no green this time, which is abnormally wet. And while climate change can also make places wetter, in the Americas, specifically on the western half, including even half of Texas, drought is one of the biggest issues caused by climate change. And drought isn't the only one that causes wildfires. Drier conditions in general can contribute to wildfires, particularly in California, as we were talking about. So things like warmer temperatures in general causing increased evaporation. Less snowpack means that the precipitation that does fall in the winter doesn't last as long. We don't have as much to go through the year. And on top of that, it gets warmer earlier. So these earlier springs and summer means the snowpack is melting even faster, causing drier conditions way earlier in the year. So that's just what contributes to the wildfires getting bigger, spreading, making the tinder just easier to light. But climate change also contributes to the ignition itself. Outside of human-caused wildfires or human-started wildfires, lightning strikes are huge for why wildfires start. And for every 1 degree Celsius increase, lightning strikes increase by about 12%, somewhere between 7 and 17%. And that means that as we continue on this path of global warming, our lightning strikes are going to increase more, and not only the intensity of our wildfires, but the rate of our wildfires are going to increase as well. Unfortunately, wildfires are one of those double whammies, kind of like the ice caps melting. As more wildfires happen, more particles are released into the air, more greenhouse gases, therefore increasing climate change. Another point I want to make about wildfires is not just how it's related to climate change, but how it creates homelessness. So here's a quote. In a recent survey, Sonoma County residents declared that in 2018, 34% of residents were affected by fires in some way. It's a huge portion of this county's population. Okay, while in 2019, only 19% were affected. You can see it's way up from the previous year. So this is the big part. Within those who responded, 4% said they were homeless because of the fire. After the fires, 68% of residents were unable to find housing because of unaffordable rent conditions. So the unaffordable rent conditions, we're talking about California at this point. We already know it's hard enough to find affordable housing as it is. It's hard to find housing in general. For somebody who's poor, for somebody who has maybe lost their vital documents like their social security card in a fire, for somebody who doesn't have that social safety net that some of us are allotted, to lose your home to a fire, whether it's one that you own or one that you're renting, sets you back so far and puts you at a huge risk of homelessness. I want to also talk about how if you look at these numbers, 34% of residents were affected by the fire. For a place that housing is already limited, suddenly having a third of your population looking for housing, the competition to try to get one of those available units is huge. All of a sudden, the housing stock is way down. And maybe people who might have been able to find a place if only their house burned down are now competing with a huge percent of the population, just ushering them into homelessness in effect. The third way I want to talk about wildfires, though, is how wildfires affect those who are already homeless, or perhaps people who have become homeless due to one wildfire and there are more raging nearby. Similar to what we were talking about with pollution, you already know the first half of the sentence now. what we're seeing is that people have asthma, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or heart disease, which is very common in the homeless populations, as we saw, is that smoke worsens those symptoms or those people, and it makes it harder to breathe. I am not sure if I can emphasize enough how bad the air quality is next to a wildfire. Like I said, there's some in Texas. I've been in Austin, I've been in Houston, and fires hundreds of miles away. You can see the smoke. For wildfires that are close to urban centers, you can't just see the smoke. Like, we saw the pictures that looked all apocalyptic with the orange and red hues, but there's also ash literally falling on people outside. So for people who live outside, just constantly getting coated with ash, you can imagine the impact it has on somebody's lungs. In California, they recommend you don't go outside in some places without an N95 mask, which we all know how hard they are to find and is almost impossible for a homeless person to find if there's not some kind of services provided to help give them out. And this is, again, isn't just about coronavirus. The N95 isn't for coronavirus. It's about trying to keep the particulate out of your lungs, because everybody knows it is so unsafe. But they don't have the option to go inside where there's an air purifier or where there's an AC. They have to stay outside in these tragically dangerous conditions. All right, that's all very sad. But moving on to Texas, we can be sad about something else for a little bit. Texas has an issue, in particular Houston. This is especially what I'll be talking about in Texas, is Houston, with flooding. Now, the flooding in Texas is not so much caused by rising sea levels, though it contributes. It is mostly caused by major storms, and maybe storms that we did not perceive to be as major as they were. So when I'm talking about major storms, I'm mostly talking about hurricanes, but also tropical storms, tropical depressions, and global warming is absolutely impacting what is happening here in Texas. We see floodplains that used to be 100-year floods that are shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, that you would expect to see it a couple times in your lifetime. So one thing we know for sure about the way climate change affects these major storms is that it is making storms more intense. As the waters in the Atlantic, but also in particular the Gulf of Mexico, if we're talking about Houston, the storms are getting way more powerful, way larger, way faster. There is some consensus on that for sure. There's also some evidence that isn't as widely accepted, but I have the evidence here for you, that there's also more storms. Just this year, we are tied with a record of the most storms in the Atlantic at one time, at 5, all at one time. This year, we also went through the entire 27-letter alphabet. We went through the whole alphabet, and now we're in the Greek alphabet, which we're not supposed to have to do. And you can see the numbers of storms increasing throughout the year in this graph. I know you can't quite read all the years, but you can see the steady increase that's happening. So this is absolutely a way climate change is contributing to flooding in Houston in particular. How does flooding affect homelessness? Much the same way wildfires affect homelessness. When it floods, people are no longer able to live in their homes, and the housing stock is reduced. Houston has been actually on top of trying to house homeless people for a while. So Houston has seen their numbers dropping over time. It's very exciting to look at. But if you look at 2018, you can see the homeless population actually rises from 3,600 to 4,100. And there was a study done. So volunteers interviewed not the entire homeless population, but 1,600 unsheltered people in Houston, and 18% said they were on the streets because of Harvey. Now that might be directly because of Harvey, but there's also other impacts that could cause somebody to not be able to leave homelessness because of flooding. And that's kind of what I'm getting into as far as the effects of flooding on the population that's already homeless in this slide. If you're already homeless, absolutely, you will have issues when there are storms with the rain and the wind. It is dramatically unsafe. We also know that the water that is in the streets is even more dangerous during a storm because of the way it mixes with other water systems. Homeless people also have trouble evacuating. Some homeless people have cars, not everybody does. They also tend not to have the same sort of local family networks that will allow them to get help in evacuating. There are city initiatives to help get people to evacuate, but in my experience working in homeless services, they have fallen short and have been unable to help everybody. Those programs are also only enacted if we expect the storm to be bad, which we know isn't always the case. Sometimes we get dramatic flooding that we don't expect as a city. On top of that, while they may open additional shelters during a storm that they expect, when they don't expect, they might not. And our shelters are already at capacity. People already want to be in the shelters. So especially when there's a rainstorm, it is even harder to find access to a shelter. If we're talking about the post-storm shelters, those are also filled mostly and specifically for the people who have lost their housing. And then this last point I want to make is a big one that I think I was not aware of before I started working in homeless services, and it is that it is harder to hold on to your vital documents, that being your birth certificate, voter's registration card, marriage license, and then especially your ID and social security card. It is so hard to hold on to a social security card when your encampment or where you set up your tent has been flooded, washed away by a flood. I've had multiple clients who have lost their vital documents in a flood and then were unable to get services because they needed to get a new vital document. I want to emphasize how difficult getting these things can be for people. We already know we don't like to go to the DMV, we don't like to wait in line, and we don't like to drive out there. On top of that, homeless people don't have the money to pay for it. They might not have the transportation to get there. They might not have an address to get it mailed to. So it's even harder for them to get a vital document. So when it is lost in a flood, it's all the more catastrophic if they're trying to apply for a job, if they're trying to apply for help with housing, if they're trying to apply for food stamps. Flooding can really set people back in that way, in addition to the trauma of being outside during a hurricane. Well, so what can we do? I know that lots of people like to take individual action. I do, I recycle, I'm vegan, but I mean specifically, what can we do as people who are literally engineering our future? Now, I really wish I could hear your responses because everybody has limited perspective and there's actually so many things we can do. There are a ton of options, but I've broken them down roughly in 2 categories and I would love for y'all to think about them and maybe email your colleagues about some ideas, or maybe if you think my stuff isn't effective. The first kind of category I want to go into is local choices. So earlier I was talking about the urban heat index effect and how there's things that we can do about that just at our local level. So that's the kind of local choices I'm talking about, things that we can do to affect our local environment. So I'm kind of focusing in on both the urban heat island effect and flooding, but absolutely just having more green spaces is huge. So urban vegetation like trees, community gardens, food forests, these sorts of things allow the soil to absorb water right where it hits, which decreases deluges, which are those huge swaths of water that flood mostly because all the impervious pavement is rushing the water into one area or one direction downstream. So rain gardens are made specifically for that, to reduce the rate at which rain falls into the soil so that it can be absorbed. Semi-pervious pavement, which is a great option for particularly parking lots, probably not freeways, but will also allow water to get absorbed. This water being absorbed also helps with the urban heat island, and it also means that wherever we have, say, a food forest or a community garden, We don't have cement holding on to and then releasing that heat at night. So these are some of the local choices we can make. I also want to give a shout out to Food Forest and Community Gardens, because it also contributes to, though not enough, another option of food sources for the homeless population. Then the other kind of category I'm talking about, I'm sure you all have some of these in your head, so just keep up with it. The other category I want to talk about is global impacts. So things we can do at our level, wherever we operate, wherever we engineer, that can impact the global climate change story. So some of you might recognize this picture. These are two satellite images of Italy, one right as the lockdown was starting and one after the lockdown had been going on for some time. And these are emission maps, pollution maps. And you can see the dramatic change. You can understand the global impacts that happened when we were releasing less particulate into our environment. And that is going to reduce the rate at which we continue global warming. I'm not going to say it's going to reverse it, but everything a city can do to reduce it is good. And you'll be able to help the vulnerable population on that global level. We'll be able to help the people in Bangladesh and Guatemala and Honduras and Haiti when we reduce our own emissions, even at a global scale or even at a local scale. So the ones that come to mind for me are mostly around traffic. So things that we can do to reduce our emissions in traffic. Increase use of public transportation. You do that by making transportation cheaper, making it more reliable, making it more desirable, whether that be cleaner or more aesthetically pleasing. Those are things that you can do to get people out of their single occupancy vehicles. Another option, bike lanes and bike infrastructure. If people are biking, they're not taking their cars. That reduces emissions. And people actually will enjoy biking. It'll also reduce our public health costs as our population gets healthier, in theory. So absolutely increased use of biking infrastructure, whether it's by adding more bike lanes or also bike paths, making them more enjoyable so people are incentivized to take their bike instead of their car. As it is now, single occupancy vehicles are pretty much incentivized. There's free parking, you might as well take your car. There's more right of way. Oftentimes the way the roads are laid out is with the single occupancy vehicle in mind first. We can do things to redesign our cities to reduce our emissions. And this is just one way. Transportation is just one type of emission we have. But when we reduce our emissions, we can reduce our global impact, which will also affect our local. And I know that these things cost money. I know you're going to present a project and they're going to be like, how much? These are some of the issues that we're facing as we push for the things that we believe in, is that oftentimes it comes to the budget. Where does this budget come from? Mostly, I believe that this budget can come from seeing it as an investment, because what we're doing now is kind of costing us money in the long run. There's some evidence now in the homeless literature about how the housing first model, which is where you just house people that are homeless with as little bureaucracy as possible, with as little roadblocks as possible, it actually saves the city money, it saves the state's money, it saves our government in general money. And that's mostly because of the healthcare cost. When you house people, the healthcare, the public health costs reduce because they're not going to the emergency room as much. They don't have as many issues with, say, their lungs as they would before. And when those individuals can't pay for it, it winds up being on the government. So in this way, we've seen in some places, in many places, how housing the homeless population winds up freeing up money for the local governments to be used in other places. This is a beautiful thing because it's a way that we can combine these two ideas and allow us to have some money to play around with to actually enact these changes. Similarly, though, about paying up front instead of over time when disaster hits, climate change is actually very, very expensive. The reduced damage to our infrastructure and private property, because we have reduced climate catastrophes, that would be excellent for our budgets, actually, because storms are just getting more and more expensive. Harvey cost $125 billion. It did $125 billion with a B dollars of damage. Katrina is the most expensive storm, just one above Harvey, $160 billion worth of damage. We could invest this money early on to prevent these storms instead of trying to patchwork it together after the fact. And not only, let's say we just broke even on the money, we would be saving people time, we would be saving people stress, we would absolutely be improving public health. So honestly, I think it makes sense. But going further, it's just going to get more and more expensive if we don't address climate change. It's just going to get more and more costly to our global environments. And the reason I want to emphasize this is because I know this is a roadblock environmentalists have run into before. But the fact is, we can't afford not to. We just can't. And it's getting more and more expensive not to as we go on. That's all for me. So thank you and good luck out there.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Kris, for taking the time today. Would you like to take any questions at this time?
Yeah, I could take a couple questions.
Okay, guys. If you have any questions, you can leave it in the chat or go ahead and unmute yourselves now.
Good. I covered it all. I thought I did.
Sandra, do you have anything you'd like to say?
I really hope that this can create an ongoing conversation for y'all. I know your organization emphasizes kind of the environmental aspects of things, but with information like this, you can go to people who care about, say, the homeless population and make that argument that they should also care about sustainability if they care about our homeless population. And there are other ways, there are other avenues for things like this too. I know I made the economic argument a little bit earlier. I really hope that y'all can be advocates for the programs that you care about in ways beyond the ways that we may care about them at first glance, which is the environmental effects. So I'm really excited. I hope you guys can continue these conversations with each other and brainstorm about it because we have a lot of work to do. We do.
Definitely, I agree. And of course, this is why we have ESW talks, because we're trying to expose as many people to this kind of information. And hopefully, something comes out of this. But yes, Kris, thank you very much for sharing this knowledge with us today. And on behalf of ESW and Earth Hacks, we are so grateful that you took the time to share with us. So for everyone else, thank you for joining and attending this lecture. Next week, we're having another talk at 5 p.m. Eastern time. So go ahead and attend that one as well. Sanjana, I'm not sure if you had anything to say.
Yeah, just thank you so much to Kris for coming for that really, really thought-provoking talk, and really tying together a lot of the different themes. I think that sometimes we tend to think that these are disparate topics that don't relate to each other, but they're really, really intertwined. So appreciate your insight, and thanks to everyone for attending.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.